Imagine inflation is like a runaway freight train barreling down the tracks way too fast. The Fed's got one main tool, a massive brake lever. They've been yanking on that thing with all their might, those record-setting interest rate hikes, desperately trying to slow this beast down. The problem is they're flying a bit blind. They're not sure how close they are to the station, that sweet spot where inflation gets under control. Jerome Powell, head honcho at the Fed, is determined to keep pulling that lever. He's laser focused on hitting that terminal rate, the magic speed where they can ease off the brakes and let the train naturally coast to a stop. But here's the catch, it's hard to see exactly where that point is. It's like trying to find your glasses right when you need them the most to see clearly. Economists are buzzing with debate. Some say we're getting close to the station. They point to things like cooling housing demand in 2024 as a sign things are starting to slow naturally. Others warn that the train's still moving too fast, and if we don't brake harder, we risk a major derailment down the line. An even worse inflationary spiral. Right now it's a waiting game. Every economic report is like squinting through the fog, trying to see if the station is finally in sight. Some economists argue that we might have already slowed the inflation train way down. It's like the difference between a bad bruise that'll eventually heal and a major injury needing serious treatment. See, inflation caused by supply chain snarls and high energy costs like a bruise tends to fix itself as prices finally discourage people from buying so much stuff. That seems to be happening already. Demand is cooling off in 2024, but Powell's worried about inflation becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. If everyone panics about prices always going up, they rush to buy everything now at any price, like a Black Friday sale turned into a year-long frenzy. That kind of hard-to-tame inflation is the Fed's worst nightmare. Imagine the Fed as a chef trying to control the heat under a pot of soup. Inflation is the simmer. It needs to be steady, not boiling over. Jerome Powell, the Fed chair, is determined to use interest rates as the dial on the stove. His plan: raise rates until they hit a mysterious terminal rate, the setting where inflation naturally cools down like the soup simmering gently without needing constant adjustments. But here's the rub. As experts point out, the Fed isn't perfect at diagnosing the kind of inflation we're facing. Is it a short-term issue like a temporary shortage causing ingredient prices to spike, think wonky weather delaying vegetable harvests in 2024? Or is it a deeper problem like everyone constantly cranking up their heat demand side inflation? The first kind often sorts itself out like the veggie prices eventually coming down with a good harvest. The second kind needs a more aggressive approach, like lowering the heat altogether, the challenge. The Fed needs to be sure they're using the right tools for the right reasons before the soup boils over or gets burnt to the bottom of the pot. Think of inflation like a bad injury. Imagine you trip and take a hard fall. Ouch. At first you're not sure if it's just a bad bruise or something more serious. Maybe it's like those crazy gasoline price spikes we saw in 2024. Painful in the short term, but eventually they settled back down as the oil supply issues eased. That's kind of like stubbing your toe hurts like heck, but heals on its own. But what if the injury is deeper, like a bad break that needs a doctor's attention, a cast, and time to mend properly? That's the Fed's fear with inflation, that it'll become embedded with everyone expecting prices to always go higher, causing them to spend frantically now, which makes the problem even worse. The Fed's aggressively raising interest rates, like putting the economy in traction, hoping to break that cycle. The problem is the cure might end up hurting worse than the original injury if it turns out this inflation was the stubbed toe variety all along. Powell keeps hammering this point. Fighting inflation is job number one. He warns that it's going to hurt, meaning those interest rate hikes could bring a recession, job loss, the whole ugly picture. The thing is, those high prices are doing some of the Fed's dirty work for them. Think about it. Even if you really want those new shoes, if they're double what you paid last year, you might just walk on by, multiply that across the whole economy in 2024, and folks tightening their belts starts to drag inflation back down. This puts the Fed in a weird spot. They can claim victory saying their tough medicine worked, or they can worry we're only seeing the start of the economic pain. If people stop spending out of fear, not just because things are pricey, that's a whole different kind of problem. It's the difference between skipping dessert to be healthier and skipping meals because you genuinely can't afford them. Jerome Powell is a student of history, particularly the kind that keeps a central banker up at night. He's haunted by the ghost of the 1980s when runaway inflation was like a monster terrorizing the economy. Back then, Fed Chairman Paul Volcker had to take drastic action, jacking up interest rates to crazy heights. It hurt a lot, but it eventually tamed the beast. The nightmare scenario for Powell is repeating what's called the Volcker mistake. Volcker eased up on the brakes too soon, and bam, inflation came roaring back like a bad horror movie sequel. Powell is determined not to be the guy who celebrates victory prematurely, only to have the monster reappear stronger than ever. This is why he's ignoring Wall Street's pleas to stop raising rates. Those investors are focused on the short-term pain, like rising mortgage costs in 2024, slowing down the housing market. But Powell's got his eye on the long game. He's worried that if he blinks now, letting inflation linger, we could be setting ourselves up for a repeat of that 1980s nightmare. Of course, there's the risk of overcorrecting. The Fed could keep squeezing the economy so hard that they bring on a nasty recession that wasn't really necessary. It's a high-stakes poker game, and Powell's betting that the threat of long-term inflation is the scarier opponent. Some economist has a theory that might make the Fed squirm. They believe we might already hit that sweet spot, the terminal rate where inflation starts to naturally simmer down. If he's right, then every additional interest rate hike is like pouring gasoline on a fire that's starting to go out. Here's the crux of his argument. There are two main flavors of inflation, and the Fed's using the wrong recipe. First, there's supply-side inflation. Think of those crazy egg prices in early 2024 due to bird flu outbreaks. Ugly for a while, but eventually the chicken farms recovered and grocery prices stabilized. That kind often heals itself as the underlying problems work their way out. Second, there's the nasty demand-side inflation. That's where folks are so convinced prices will keep soaring that they buy everything in sight now. That panic buying fuels the very thing they're afraid of. This is what the Fed dreads and what their interest rate hammer is designed to beat down. Economists argue that we're mostly seeing leftovers from that supply-side mess earlier on. People are still flinching from high prices, but panic buying is cooling off. Powell, though, seems fixated on that old-school demand-side monster, and in other economists' view, they might be fighting a battle that's already been won. It looks like the Fed's going to squeeze a bit more with those interest rate hikes. Powell's still got that 1980s inflation nightmare rattling around in his head, and he's not taking any chances. But the million-dollar question, or maybe $1 trillion given the size of our economy, is whether he's going overboard. Economists argue that a lot of this inflation headache might clear up on its own. Think about how those used car prices finally started coming down in 2024, once the computer chip shortage eased up. Demand for cars didn't disappear. The supply issues were the culprit. If that pattern holds some of this inflation, pain could fade without the Fed piling on even more. The tricky part is nobody has a crystal ball. The Fed could be right, and easing off now could lead to an even worse inflation comeback down the road. Or economists could be spot on, and those extra hikes might send us into a deeper recession than we really needed. It's a high-stakes gamble, and the average person is stuck feeling the impact either way. Only time will tell who's right. Will the history books praise Powell for his tough stance, or will we be debating whether the Fed's actions in 2024 turned a manageable slowdown into an unnecessary economic disaster?